They laughed when the old cowboy gave his last piece of bread to a starving Apache boy, but by sunrise, 200 warriors would ride into the valley and no one would laugh again. Caleb Whitaker had lived alone on that stretch of dry land for so long that even the wind seemed to recognize him. His ranch sat in a quiet valley nearly 15 miles from the nearest town, a small patch of stubborn life surrounded by miles of dusty plains and low rolling hills. The wooden fence leaned in places where time had worn it down. The barn roof sagged slightly under years of sun and winter storms, and the only steady sounds most days were the slow creak of leather and the gentle shuffle of hooves from the two horses that still shared the land with him. Caleb was 72 years old, though the years showed more in the quiet way he moved than in the strength that still remained in his hands. Those hands had spent a lifetime holding reins, mending fences, and guiding cattle across land that didn't always welcome a man's effort. His beard had turned the color of pale desert dust, and deep lines rested around his eyes like old trails worn by weather and memory. Folks in town called him the quiet cowboy, a man who spoke little and asked even less. Some said he had once ridden with great cattle drives. Others claimed he had seen more of the frontier than most men ever would. But Caleb never confirmed or denied any story. He simply lived his days in silence, tending the small ranch that had become the last place he called home. That evening the sky stretched wide and orange above the valley, the kind of sunset that painted the clouds in long streaks of gold before fading into the deep blue of night. Caleb sat on the wooden step outside his cabin, slowly chewing the last piece of cornbread he had baked the day before. A tin cup of coffee rested beside him, still warm from the fire inside. His old horse Ranger stood nearby, lazily swatting flies with his tail, while the cooler night air began to drift down from the hills. For a while, nothing moved. The valley was quiet in that familiar frontier way where even the wind seemed to pause and listen. Then Ranger lifted his head. His ears turned sharply toward the barn. Caleb noticed the change immediately. Horses didn't waste motion. When they listened, something was usually there. Caleb rose slowly, brushing the dust from his worn denim coat, and walked toward the barn with steady steps. The wooden door creaked when he pushed it open, and the faint smell of hay and leather filled the air. Moonlight slipped through the cracks in the boards, laying pale stripes across the floor. At first, Caleb thought a coyote might have slipped inside looking for warmth. But then he saw the small figure crouched near the feed trough. A boy, no more than 10 years old, thin as a fence rail and trembling with exhaustion. The boy's dark hair hung loosely around his face, and his clothes were worn and dusty from travel across the open land. He was scooping handfuls of grain meant for the horses and trying to eat it quickly, as if afraid someone might take it away. When the boy noticed Caleb standing in the doorway, he froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Caleb looked at the child carefully. The boy's cheeks were hollow, his eyes tired and cautious. Around his neck hung a small leather cord holding a turquoise bead. Caleb had seen beads like that before. Apache. The boy slowly stepped back from the trough, unsure whether to run or stay. Caleb didn't reach for a rope. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he simply walked past the boy toward a wooden shelf near the wall where a small cloth bundle rested. Inside it was the last of the food Caleb had prepared for the week, a thick piece of cornbread and a strip of dried beef. He paused for only a moment before taking both pieces out and holding them toward the child. The boy stared, surprised, as if the offer didn't make sense. Caleb gave a small nod, the same quiet nod he had given cattle, horses, and strangers for most of his life. The boy stepped forward slowly and accepted the food. He ate carefully at first, then faster once he realized it wasn't going to disappear. The barn remained quiet except for the soft sound of chewing and the gentle shifting of horses nearby. Caleb leaned against the wooden wall and watched the boy finish the last bite. After a moment, the boy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked up at him. His voice was quiet but steady when he spoke. "My father will remember." Caleb didn't ask what the boy meant. Out on the frontier, a man learned early that not every sentence needed an answer. The boy gave a small, respectful nod, then slipped out of the barn and disappeared into the silver moonlight of the valley. Caleb stood there for a long moment listening to the fading footsteps in the dust. He had no way of knowing that before the next sunrise the quiet valley would fill with the sound of 200 horses riding toward his land. The night settled slowly over the valley after the boy disappeared into the darkness, and Caleb Whitaker stood in the doorway of the barn for several quiet minutes listening to the wide silence of the frontier. The moon hung low above the hills, casting pale silver light across the dry grass and the long stretch of land that had belonged to him for nearly 20 years. Nothing moved out there now. The boy had vanished as quietly as he had appeared, leaving behind only a few faint footprints in the dust and the empty trough where he had tried to eat grain meant for horses. Caleb closed the barn door and walked back toward the cabin, his boots pressing softly into the dirt path he had traveled thousands of times before. Ranger lifted his head again as Caleb passed, watching the old cowboy with the calm patience of a horse that had known the same man for many seasons. Caleb paused long enough to pat the animal gently along the neck before stepping onto the small wooden porch. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, glowing orange beneath a thin layer of ash. Caleb knelt beside it and added 2 small pieces of mesquite wood, listening as the flames slowly woke again with a quiet crackle. The cabin was simple and narrow, built from rough timber many years earlier by hands that had long since moved on. A narrow bed rested along one wall beside a wooden chest that held the few belongings Caleb still owned. A small iron stove stood near the center of the room, and beside it sat a square table with only one chair. That chair had not been shared with anyone in a very long time. Caleb poured the last of the coffee from the tin pot into his cup and sat down slowly, staring at the small circle of firelight dancing across the floorboards. The boy's words returned to him in the quiet of the room. "My father will remember." Caleb repeated the sentence in his mind, turning it over the way a rancher studies tracks in the dust. It was not a threat. The boy had not spoken with anger or fear. The words had sounded more like a promise carried carefully from one place to another. Caleb took a slow sip of the cooling coffee and leaned back in his chair. Out here, people did not travel alone unless something had gone wrong. A child especially did not cross miles of open land without reason. The frontier had its own way of delivering messages, and sometimes those messages arrived quietly in the middle of the night wearing dust and hunger. Caleb rose again and stepped to the window that faced the wide valley. The land stretched out nearly 2 miles before the hills began to rise, a broad sweep of grass and scattered sagebrush that had turned golden under the moonlight. He had chosen that ranch because of the quiet. Years earlier, he had come west with nothing but a horse and a saddlebag, looking for a place where the past could finally grow distant. The valley had offered that gift. No crowded streets, no loud voices, only wind, sky, and the steady work of living one day at a time. Caleb had repaired the broken fence lines, cleared the old well, and rebuilt the barn with lumber hauled from a town nearly 20 miles away. The land had never made him rich, but it had given him something more valuable: peace. Ranger shifted outside again, his hooves making a soft thud against the ground. Caleb listened for a moment, then opened the door and stepped onto the porch once more. The air had grown cooler now, carrying the clean scent of dry grass and distant cedar. He walked to the edge of the porch and studied the valley carefully. The boy was gone. The tracks leading away from the barn pointed toward the northern hills where the land rose into narrow ridges and shallow canyons. Caleb knew those hills well. A rider could travel through them, unseen for miles if he knew the right paths. Caleb stood there for a long time, watching the quiet land beneath the moon. Finally, he turned and returned inside the cabin, setting the empty cup on the table before lowering himself onto the narrow bed. The fire continued to burn softly, filling the room with gentle warmth while the wind brushed against the cabin walls. Outside, the valley slept. Hours passed slowly, the kind of deep frontier night where every sound traveled clearly across the open land. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once before silence returned. Caleb slept lightly as always, the way men do when they have spent their lives under open skies. Then sometime near the edge of dawn, Ranger made a sound Caleb had not heard in years. It was not fear. It was recognition. Caleb opened his eyes instantly. The ground beneath the cabin seemed to carry a faint vibration, too distant to be thunder, yet too steady to be wind. He sat up slowly, listening. The vibration came again, stronger now. Hoofbeats. Many of them. Caleb rose from the bed and stepped toward the door just as the first thin line of sunrise began to spread across the eastern horizon. Caleb Whitaker opened the cabin door just as the first thin light of dawn spilled across the valley floor, and the sound became unmistakable now, steady hoofbeats rolling across the open land like distant thunder moving through dry grass. Ranger stood near the fence with his ears pointed forward and his muscles tense, not in fear, but in the alert posture of a horse that sensed many riders approaching at once. Caleb stepped onto the porch and looked east across the 2-mile stretch of open ground that separated his ranch from the rising hills. At first he saw only dust, a long pale ribbon of dust lifting slowly into the morning sky where the sunlight touched it. Then shapes began to appear beneath that dust, dark moving figures cresting the low ridge one by one until the valley that had been empty only moments ago began to fill with motion. Riders, dozens of them. Caleb stood still with his hands resting loosely at his sides as the riders continued forward, spreading across the valley in a wide line that followed the natural curve of the land. The morning light grew stronger with each passing second, revealing more detail. Horses of many colors moved together in quiet rhythm, their hooves sending small clouds of dust drifting across the dry grass. The riders wore simple clothing suited for long travel, and many carried long spears that rose upright above the line like tall, thin shadows against the brightening sky. Caleb had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize what he was seeing. These were Apache riders, a large number of them, far more than a single hunting party. The line continued to grow as more riders appeared over the ridge behind the first group. 20, then 50, then more still, spreading across the valley in a wide arc that slowly curved toward the ranch. Caleb counted without realizing he was doing it. The numbers climbed steadily until the full shape of the gathering became clear. Nearly 200 riders moved across the open land with calm purpose, their horses stepping carefully through the grass, as if following a path known long before the sun had risen. The valley that had belonged to silence for years now carried the low rhythm of hooves and the faint creak of leather saddles. Caleb rested one hand on the porch railing and watched them approach. He did not reach for the rifle hanging beside the cabin door. Out here, actions carried meaning long before words were spoken. Raising a weapon too quickly could turn a meeting into something else entirely. The riders slowed as they reached the lower ground about half a mile from the ranch. The line shifted slightly, forming a broad circle that spread across the valley like a quiet ring of movement around the old homestead. Dust settled slowly in the cool morning air while the horses stepped forward in careful silence. Ranger shifted again near the fence but remained calm, watching the riders the same way Caleb did, curious but steady. Caleb noticed something unusual as the riders drew closer. No one shouted. No one rushed ahead. The entire group moved with a calm patience that carried the weight of purpose rather than threat. The riders stopped nearly 300 yards from the cabin, forming a wide semicircle that stretched across the valley floor. 200 horses stood quietly beneath the rising sun, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Caleb Whitaker had lived through many long seasons on the frontier, and he understood that moments like this carried their own language. Silence was often the first sentence. For several seconds nothing changed. The riders remained still. The valley wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the smell of dust and leather across the open space between the ranch and the gathering. Then one horse stepped forward from the center of the line. The rider guiding that horse sat tall in the saddle, wearing a dark coat decorated with simple beadwork that caught the early sunlight. The horse moved slowly toward the cabin, closing the distance with calm, deliberate steps. Caleb watched carefully as the rider approached. When the horse reached the open space about 50 yards from the porch, it stopped. The rider looked toward the cabin for a long moment before raising one hand slightly. From the line of riders behind him, a smaller figure stepped forward on foot. Caleb felt a quiet recognition settle in his chest even before the boy reached the front of the gathering. The same thin shape, the same turquoise bead hanging from a leather cord. The boy from the barn walked beside the rider and stopped near the horse, turning his face toward the cabin. The rising sun lit his features clearly now. The boy lifted his hand and pointed gently toward Caleb Whitaker, standing on the porch. The boy stood beside the rider and kept his hand raised toward the cabin, his small arm steady in the quiet morning light, while the 200 riders behind him remained completely still across the valley. Caleb Whitaker stepped down from the porch slowly, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath his boots as he moved toward the open yard. Rangers shifted behind the fence but did not move away, watching the scene with the calm patience of a horse that trusted the man standing beside the cabin. The boy took a few steps forward across the dry grass until he stood nearly 20 yards from Caleb. The turquoise bead around his neck glinted briefly as the sunlight rose higher above the hills. Up close, the boy looked very different from the frightened child who had crouched beside the feed trough the night before. His posture was straighter now, and his eyes carried a quiet confidence that had not been there in the barn. He turned toward the rider beside him and spoke softly in his own language. The rider listened without interrupting, his face calm and thoughtful. After the boy finished speaking, the rider guided his horse forward several slow steps, closing the distance between himself and the old rancher. The horse stopped about 30 feet from Caleb Whitaker. For a moment, the valley held its breath again. Caleb studied the man sitting in the saddle. The rider appeared to be near 50 years old, with strong features shaped by years beneath the open sky. A simple feather rested along the side of his dark hair, and the beadwork on his coat formed patterns that caught the sunlight in quiet colors. His presence carried the kind of calm authority that came from experience rather than display. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "The boy says you gave him food when he had none." Caleb Whitaker nodded once. "That is true." The rider looked down briefly at the child standing beside his horse, then back toward Caleb. "He says you asked no questions." Caleb rested his hands loosely at his sides. "A hungry boy does not need questions. He needs bread." The rider studied Caleb for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of those words. Behind him, the wide circle of riders remained silent, their horses shifting gently in the morning light while the valley wind moved through the grass. Finally, the rider stepped down from the saddle and stood beside his horse. Up close, he appeared even taller than he had from a distance. The boy walked to his side and looked up at him with quiet respect. The rider placed one hand lightly on the boy's shoulder before turning again toward Caleb Whitaker. "I am called Black Eagle," he said. "This boy is my son." The sentence rested in the air between them with quiet meaning. Caleb Whitaker glanced once toward the long line of riders surrounding the valley and then back to the man standing before him. "Your son arrived hungry," Caleb said. "That is all I saw." Black Eagle nodded slowly. "My son had traveled far through the hills. He had been separated from our camp while following the tracks of wild horses. The land beyond the northern ridges can be harsh for someone his age." The boy looked down briefly at the ground as his father spoke, then lifted his eyes again toward Caleb. Black Eagle continued, in the same steady voice, "When a child returns home safely after such a journey, his father must understand the path that carried him there." Caleb Whitaker said nothing. The wind shifted again across the valley, brushing through the dry grass between the ranch and the waiting riders. Black Eagle looked toward the old barn for a moment and then back to Caleb. "My son told us of the man who shared his food and gave him warmth beside the fire. He said the man did this without fear and without asking what tribe the boy belonged to." The Apache leader paused briefly before speaking again. "Among our people, kindness given freely carries a memory that does not fade." Caleb Whitaker glanced once more toward the 200 riders standing across the valley. The circle of horses remained still beneath the rising sun, their riders watching quietly as the conversation unfolded near the ranch. The boy stepped forward then and spoke in a clear voice that carried across the open yard. "I told them what you did." Caleb looked down at him. "I only gave you a meal." The boy shook his head gently. "You gave more than that." Black Eagle turned slightly and lifted one arm toward the wide circle of riders stretching across the valley floor. The movement was simple but deliberate. These men came because of that meal. The wind moved through the valley again, carrying the faint sound of leather and quiet breathing horses across the open land, while Caleb Whitaker stood beside his cabin and began to understand that the boy's words from the night before had carried far more meaning than he had first believed. The words settled across the quiet yard like dust drifting through still air, and for several seconds Caleb Whitaker simply stood there studying the valley that had once been empty and now held 200 riders waiting in patient silence beneath the growing light of morning. He had spent most of his life on the frontier, and he understood that gatherings like this did not happen without meaning. Out here men did not ride for miles across dry land at sunrise unless something important had brought them together. Caleb shifted his weight slightly and glanced once more at the boy standing beside his father. In the soft light of morning the child looked stronger than he had the night before, his shoulders squared and his eyes steady as he watched the old cowboy who had given him bread beside a warm fire. Black Eagle followed Caleb's gaze and nodded slowly, as if acknowledging an understanding that needed no long explanation. Among my people, the Apache leader said, kindness is not a small thing. A meal shared when a traveler is hungry becomes a story that is carried home. The wind moved across the valley again, brushing through the tall grass and lifting small swirls of dust near the horses that stood quietly across the wide circle of riders. Caleb folded his arms loosely and looked toward the distant line of men who had traveled across miles of open land to stand here this morning. That is a long ride for a story about bread, he said calmly. Black Eagle allowed the smallest hint of a smile to cross his face. It is not only the bread, he replied. It is what the bread means. The boy stepped forward again and spoke softly. I told them you did not ask my tribe. You did not ask my name. You only saw that I was hungry. Caleb nodded once. That is usually enough reason. The Apache leader turned and looked across the valley toward the riders. Several of them shifted slightly in their saddles, but none moved from their place in the wide circle. The sun had risen higher, now painting the hills with pale gold and revealing the full number of horses gathered across the grassland. Nearly 200 riders waited with calm patience, as if time itself moved slower in their presence. Black Eagle spoke again without raising his voice. For many seasons our people have traveled these lands. We have learned that kindness is not always given freely here. The boy looked up at his father and then toward Caleb Whitaker. Last night when I returned to our camp, I told them of the old cowboy who shared his last meal. Some of the men doubted the story at first, but I told them what I saw. Black Eagle nodded again. And when a son speaks truth, his father must listen. Caleb rested one hand on the porch rail and looked toward the distant hills. The valley had been quiet for so many years that it almost felt strange to hear voices carried by the morning wind. I did not expect a gathering, he said. Black Eagle turned slightly toward the open land surrounding the ranch. These riders did not come only to thank you. They came because gratitude should be seen as well as spoken. Caleb lifted an eyebrow. That is a powerful way to say thank you. The Apache leader stepped closer to the boy and placed his hand again on the child's shoulder. My son told them that the man who helped him lives here alone. He said the ranch sits far from the town and far from the roads where other men pass through. Caleb glanced once more toward the circle of riders and then back to Black Eagle. That is true enough. Black Eagle looked slowly around the valley as if studying every hill and fence line. Then he spoke the words that carried the weight of the gathering. A man who shows kindness when no one is watching deserves to know he is not alone. The boy stepped forward once more and looked directly at Caleb Whitaker. My father says our people remember those who help us. Caleb studied the faces of the riders across the valley. They sat quietly in their saddles watching the small group near the ranch house. The wind moved gently through the grass again, and the faint sound of leather saddles shifting traveled across the open land. Black Eagle raised his arm slightly and motioned toward the riders surrounding the valley. These men came because of the path your kindness created. For a moment Caleb Whitaker said nothing. Then he looked toward the hills and the long stretch of land that had been his home for so many silent years, and he began to realize that something had changed in the quiet valley where he had once believed he lived completely alone. Caleb Whitaker remained standing near the porch while the morning light continued to spread across the valley, turning the tall grass pale gold and revealing every rider waiting quietly beyond the fence line. For nearly 20 years this land had belonged to silence, broken only by wind, cattle, and the slow work of a single man. Now 200 horses stood across the valley floor, their breath drifting into the cool air while their riders watched with calm patience. Caleb studied the scene carefully, not with fear, but with the quiet attention of someone who had spent his life reading the language of open country. Out here, every gathering carried meaning. Every movement carried a message. Black Eagle followed Caleb's gaze across the wide circle of riders and then spoke again in a steady voice. Many seasons ago, our people traveled through these valleys often. The rivers ran stronger then and the grass was taller. But in recent years, the trails have changed. More travelers come through this land now. Traders, prospectors, men looking for silver in the hills. Caleb nodded slightly. He had seen those changes as well. Wagon tracks sometimes appeared along the southern ridge where strangers passed through searching for opportunity in the rough country beyond the valley. Some of those travelers carried good intentions. Others carried trouble that drifted across the land like dry wind. Black Eagle continued. When my son returned to our camp, he told us something important. He said the man who helped him lives here alone and protects this land with quiet work. The Apache leader paused and looked directly at Caleb Whitaker. A man who lives this way deserves respect. The boy stepped closer to Caleb now, his small boots brushing through the grass. Last night, I thought you might turn me away, he said softly. Some men do when they see someone from another tribe. Caleb looked down at him and shook his head slowly. Hunger does not belong to any one tribe, he said. It belongs to the road. The boy nodded thoughtfully, as if storing those words somewhere he would remember them later. Behind him the riders shifted gently in their saddles while the wind moved through the valley once more. Black Eagle lifted his hand slightly toward the wide circle surrounding the ranch. These riders came because we wanted you to see something clearly. Caleb raised one eyebrow. And what is that? The Apache leader turned his head toward the distant hills that rose along the northern edge of the valley. There are men who pass through these lands who do not understand the meaning of respect. They see open land and believe it belongs to whoever takes it first. Caleb crossed his arms loosely as he listened. I have met a few of those men, he said quietly. Black Eagle nodded once. Some have already ridden near this valley during the past season. They ask questions in the town about the old rancher who lives alone. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm. Towns are full of questions. The Apache leader looked back toward the line of riders stretching across the valley floor. My son told us that the man who helped him asked for nothing in return. That matters to us. He stepped closer to Caleb until only a few feet separated them. Among our people, a gift of kindness creates a path between families. When that path is made, we do not allow it to be broken easily. Caleb studied the man's face and then looked once more across the valley where the riders waited beneath the rising sun. You brought 200 men to protect a path, he said slowly. Black Eagle turned toward the riders again and lifted his hand in a small signal. Several of the men nodded quietly in response, though none of them moved from their places. We brought them so that every traveler who rides through this valley will understand something important. Caleb Whitaker remained silent as the morning wind carried the sound of leather and shifting hooves across the land he had once believed belonged only to him. The boy looked up at his father and then toward the old cowboy standing beside the cabin. My father says the land remembers those who treat it with respect, he said. Caleb rested one hand against the porch rail and looked out over the valley once more. For the first time since he had built the ranch, he began to realize that the quiet land surrounding him had just gained a kind of protection no fence could ever provide. Caleb Whitaker remained still beside the porch rail while the valley slowly filled with the brighter light of morning, and the quiet circle of riders continued to hold their position across the land like a living wall of patience and watchful eyes. For many years, Caleb had believed that a man could disappear into the frontier if he worked hard enough and spoke little enough. But standing there now, he realized that even the quietest life leaves tracks that other people can follow. The boy stepped closer to the fence line and looked out toward the long arc of riders surrounding the ranch. They came because my father believes a promise should be seen, not only spoken. Caleb looked down at him and raised one eyebrow slightly. I did not know I made any promises last night. The boy smiled faintly and shook his head. You did not speak one. But kindness can sound like a promise even when no words are said. The wind moved again across the valley and carried the soft shifting of 200 horses standing patiently in the grass. Black Eagle watched the land carefully for a moment before speaking again. There are men who travel these valleys who measure strength by the size of their rifles or the number of fences they build. But our people measure strength differently. Caleb folded his arms loosely across his chest. How do you measure it? The Apache leader turned his gaze toward the hills in the north where narrow trails disappeared into the stone ridges. We measure it by what a man does when no one is watching him. Caleb looked at the ground for a moment, then back toward the riders standing beneath the morning sky. That is a quiet way to measure a man, he said. Black Eagle nodded once. The quiet ways often last the longest. The boy reached down and picked up a small piece of dry grass. twisting it slowly between his fingers while he studied the ranch. My father says you built this place yourself. Caleb gave a small shrug. Piece by piece. The boy nodded toward the barn and the long fence stretching toward the well. It looked strong. Caleb followed the direction of the boy's hand. The barn roof sagged slightly, and the fence posts leaned in a few places where the wind had pushed against them through the seasons. Strong enough for one man, he said. Black Eagle stepped forward a few paces and looked across the valley once more. 200 riders had spread themselves carefully across the land, leaving enough space between horses so that each man could watch the horizon clearly. The formation was not threatening. It was deliberate. Caleb noticed the pattern slowly and understood its meaning. These men were not here to surround him. They were here to watch the land around him. Black Eagle spoke again. When our riders travel together like this, every hill and every trail is seen by someone. Caleb looked again toward the far ridge where the sun now touched the highest stones. That is a wide watch for one ranch. The Apache leader allowed a quiet smile to appear for a brief moment. Sometimes one good act deserves a wide watch. The boy stepped closer to the fence and rested his hands on the wooden rail. Last night when I left your barn, I thought about something you said. Caleb looked down at him. What was that? You said hunger belongs to the road. The boy glanced back at the riders and then toward the ranch house. My father says respect belongs to the land. Caleb Whitaker stood quietly for a moment while the wind brushed across the valley and carried the soft sound of leather and breathing horses through the grass. The boy turned again toward his father. Will they stay long? Black Eagle looked across the circle of riders and then toward the distant trail leading south. Not forever, he said, but long enough for every traveler who passes through this valley to understand what they are seeing today. Caleb raised his eyes toward the horizon where the first distant line of wagon dust sometimes appeared during the warmer months. And what exactly will they understand? Black Eagle met his gaze calmly. They will understand that this ranch is not as alone as it once appeared. Caleb Whitaker leaned lightly against the porch rail and looked across the valley where 200 riders watched the quiet land beneath the rising sun. And for the first time in many years, the old cowboy felt something unusual settling into the stillness around his home. Not noise, not fear, but the steady presence of people who had chosen to stand beside him without asking for anything in return. Caleb Whitaker stood quietly beside the porch while the morning continued to unfold across the valley, and the sunlight now reached far enough to reveal every rider clearly against the golden grass. The land that had once felt endless and empty now carried a quiet presence that stretched from hill to hill. 200 horses stood spread across the valley floor in a wide, patient arc, their riders watching the open country with the calm attention of men who knew the land well. Caleb had lived long enough to recognize what he was seeing. This was not a show of power. It was something steadier than that. It was a promise made in plain sight. The boy leaned against the fence rail and followed Caleb's gaze across the riders. They ride like this when they want the land to remember a moment, he said. Caleb glanced down at him. The land remembers things. The boy nodded. My father says it remembers everything. Black Eagle stepped forward a few paces and looked slowly across the valley that now held his people. The morning air carried the smell of dry grass and horses while a light breeze moved across the hills. In the distance, a hawk circled above the ridgeline, drifting through the wide blue sky that stretched over the open frontier. Black Eagle spoke again in a calm, steady voice. When travelers pass through this valley in the coming months, they will see the tracks of many horses. They will hear the story in town that Apache riders stood here at sunrise. Caleb considered that quietly. Stories travel faster than riders sometimes. Black Eagle nodded slightly. That is why we let them travel. The boy looked out toward the southern trail where the road toward the small frontier town curved around the hills nearly 15 miles away. The traders who pass through there talk often, he said. Caleb gave a faint smile beneath his weathered beard. They always have. The Apache leader turned his gaze back toward the ranch house and the aging barn standing beside it. My son said you built this place with your own hands. Caleb shrugged gently. It took time. Black Eagle studied the wooden beams of the barn and the long fence line stretching across the grassland. Time is what gives land its meaning. The boy stepped away from the fence and walked a few yards toward the open yard where the dirt path led to the well. Last night when I walked away from your barn, I thought the valley would be empty again by morning, he said. Caleb looked toward the riders once more. It usually is. The boy turned and gestured toward the circle of horses surrounding the ranch. Not today. The wind drifted through the valley again and carried the quiet sound of leather saddles and shifting hooves. The riders remained steady in their places, each man watching a different part of the horizon. Caleb noticed that no matter where he looked, someone was calmly observing the distant trails. The valley had become a watchful place without raising a single weapon. Black Eagle spoke again, after a moment of silence. When men pass through these lands, they often look for signs that tell them where respect lives. Caleb folded his arms loosely. And this morning is one of those signs. The Apache leader nodded. Yes, a very clear one. The boy looked up at his father. Will they understand it? Black Eagle rested his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. Most will, and the few who do not will still see what stands here. Caleb Whitaker studied the riders again and realized that every hill and trail around his ranch now had eyes watching it. Travelers riding across the frontier would not miss the meaning of that sight. They would see the circle of Apache riders and understand that this land held a story larger than fences or deeds written in town. Caleb looked toward the northern hills where the boy had traveled alone the night before, and then back toward the quiet gathering that had filled his valley at sunrise. For many years he had believed that surviving the frontier meant learning how to stand alone. But as the sun climbed higher above the land and the 200 riders remained calmly in place around his home, the old cowboy began to understand something different. Sometimes a single act of kindness could travel farther across the frontier than any horse could ride. The sun had climbed well above the hills by the time the quiet gathering in the valley began to shift. For several long hours the riders had remained in their places across the open land, watching the trails and the distant ridges with patient attention while the morning wind moved gently through the tall grass. Caleb Whitaker leaned against the porch rail and studied the valley that had once been empty and silent, but now carried the memory of something rare. 200 riders had stood across his land without raising a single weapon or speaking a single harsh word. They had simply been there, steady and visible beneath the open sky. That alone was enough to tell a story the frontier would remember. The boy stepped away from the fence and looked up toward his father. The sun is high now, he said quietly. Black Eagle followed the direction of the sunlight across the hills and nodded once. Yes, the valley has seen what it needed to see. Caleb glanced toward the riders as a few of them began to turn their horses slowly toward the distant trails. The movement was calm and deliberate, like the slow closing of a circle that had completed its purpose. The boy watched the riders carefully as they began to drift away across the grassland in small groups. Will they return home now, he asked. Black Eagle rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. They will ride their own paths again, but the land will remember where they stood today. Caleb Whitaker straightened from the porch rail and stepped down into the yard, watching the riders as they moved across the valley floor. The sound of hoofbeats rose again, softer now as the horses walked steadily toward the distant hills. Dust lifted behind them in pale drifting clouds that slowly faded into the bright morning air. One by one the riders disappeared along different trails that led through the ridges and shallow canyons surrounding the valley. It took nearly an hour before the last of them reached the far hills and slipped beyond the stone ridgelines. When the final rider vanished, the valley returned to its old quiet once again. The wind brushed through the grass, and the open land stretched empty beneath the sky just as it had the day before. Yet Caleb knew the silence was different now. The boy walked a few steps toward the open yard and turned to face the ranch house once more. My father says a story begins the moment people carry it away with them. Caleb gave a slow nod. That sounds about right. Black Eagle stepped closer and extended his hand toward the old cowboy. Caleb Whitaker looked at the hand for a moment before reaching forward and shaking it firmly. The gesture was simple but carried a quiet understanding between the two men. You shared food with my son when he needed it most, Black Eagle said. Our people do not forget that. Caleb shrugged gently beneath the morning sun. It was only a meal. Black Eagle met his eyes calmly. Sometimes a single meal can change the path of many days. The boy smiled faintly as he listened to them. My father says the valley will be watched now even when no riders are standing here. Caleb looked across the wide land surrounding his ranch and thought about the many trails that crossed the frontier beyond the hills. Travelers would pass through this country as they always had. Some would see only grass and empty sky. But others would hear the story carried by traders and riders passing through town. They would hear how 200 Apache warriors once stood quietly around an old ranch at sunrise. Caleb rested one hand on the fence rail and watched the hawk drifting above the valley. The bird circled slowly before gliding toward the distant hills where the riders had vanished. The boy began walking toward his father's horse, while Black Eagle turned once more toward Caleb Whitaker. "If our paths cross again on this land," the Apache leader said, "you will always find friends riding nearby." Caleb nodded slowly. "That is good to know." Black Eagle mounted his horse and reached down to lift the boy easily into the saddle behind him. The horse turned toward the northern trail and began walking calmly across the grassland. After a few yards, the boy looked back and raised his hand in farewell. Caleb lifted his own hand in return and watched as the two figures rode steadily toward the distant hills. Within minutes, they too disappeared beyond the ridge, and the valley returned to its familiar quiet. Caleb Whitaker stood beside his ranch house and listened to the wind moving across the land he had worked for so many years. For the first time since he had built the small ranch, he understood that the frontier had a way of carrying kindness farther than any man could ride. And somewhere beyond the hills, 200 riders were already carrying that story across the wide open west.